One theorist that can be linked to ideology is Karl Marx. Marx believed that the wealthy exploited the non-wealthy. The wealthy otherwise knows the bourgeoisie did this by paying the non-wealthy knows the proletarians to work for them for a minimum wage, whilst the wealthy took the profit for themselves. This seems unfair and it makes no sense why the non-wealthy would simply not just quit. However, Marx stated that the reason for this was linked to ideology as said in Paul Hodgkins's book Media, Culture and Society. For Marx, the dominant ways of thinking in a society will always reflect the current mode, production and the interest of the ruling class. The dominant ways of thinking in a society is otherwise known as ideology. This dominant ideology was simply accepted by the non-wealthy because according to Marx, ideology promoted false consciousness, where the non-wealthy didn't realize that they were being exploited. There are many examples of ideology in everyday life. One of these is film company Disney, where the image of a weak princess being saved by a prince, where they then live happily ever after is heavily promoted. This creates an idea of a perfect fairy romance where everyone is happy despite the fact that real life is nothing like this. There is also the ideology of the perfect figure in regards to both men and women. The perfect figure is otherwise known as size 0, where people is shown the pressure to be smaller. Fortunately, nowadays they are shown to be many body positive enthusiasts, meaning that the ideal image of the perfect figure will eventually change. Another philosopher once stated that in order for social order to be controlled and reproduced, it can be done in two ways. Firstly, through violence, and secondly, through ideology. Louis Althusser defines ideology as a transparent molding process that configures and transconfigures human beings to respond to the demands of the conditions of existence. A system of representations where images, ideas, and concepts are produced and sustained among the society through as what Althusser calls its ideological state apparatuses. They consist of churches, schools, universities, families, and such. It is universal existing in classes and class-divided societies. Althusser insists that mankind, you and I, are no longer autonomous or free to govern ourselves to act independently, but we have become the outcome and building blocks of social structure.
Postmodernity definitely presents itself as anti-modernity. This statement describes an emotional current of our times, which has penetrated all spheres of intellectual life. It has placed on the agenda theories of post-enlightenment, post-modernity, even of post-history. Since Habermas wrote these words in 1981, this situation has only become more acute. Now, well into the 21st century, the trenches of the so-called culture war are drawn by the tension between the two worldviews we identify with modernity and post-modernity. In this episode, we're going to explore the meaning of these two terms, their historical origins, their traits, and of course, their differences. The word modern is a nebulous term that has been used to refer to the contemporary day and age since the 6th century AD. But in the past few decades, a particular time period has come to be identified as modernity. The dates of this cultural phase vary, with some calling everything after the Middle Ages modernity. Others divide the modern era into three phases. The early, corresponding to the French Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution. The classical, corresponding to the long 19th century, and late modernity, which ended somewhere between 1968 and 1989. For our purposes here, the exact dates do not matter, because we're not really talking about a historical period. Following Michel Foucault's analysis in his essay What is Enlightenment, we will be treating modernity more as an attitude than as a period of history. And this attitude is most salient in the period known as the long 19th century, which spanned from the French Revolution in 1789 to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. This was the time when modernity had come into its fullness and was the dominant force in the culture. Foucault identifies a number of traits of modernity, including a questioning or rejection of tradition, the prioritizing of individualism, freedom, and formal equality, faith in inevitable social, scientific, and technological progress, a movement from feudalism towards capitalism and the market economy, industrialization and urbanization, secularization, and the development of the nation-state, representative democracy, and public education. The groundwork for modernity was laid by the philosophers of the French Enlightenment, who influenced the founding fathers of the US and the rebels of the French Revolution. The ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the US, and liberty, equality, and fraternity in France were the clarion call of modernity. Man was liberated from his oppressors. The monarchies and aristocracies were cast aside. Church and state were separated. Modernity was to be an age of reason. The worldview of modernity was characterized by an extravagant optimism and confidence in its own power. Reason was the guiding principle of the age, and the novelty of this was intoxicating. With it came a naivety and optimism about the inevitability of progress in all spheres of life. This confidence rose to a peak at the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th. New technologies that revolutionized life were emerging every year. In the space of a few decades, dozens of world-altering inventions appeared on the scene. For the first time, we had bikes, planes and cars, light bulbs, telephones and the radio. Diseases that once wiped out entire swathes of the population were now being eradicated. Science was making rapid leaps forward, and it seemed that it was a mere matter of tying up loose ends. In the long 19th century, the laws of thermodynamics were formulated, the periodic table was created, and Einstein published his revolutionary papers on relativity. Even in philosophy, there was a fervent excitement about the new study of language and logic. In one of the most typical expressions of modernity's self-confidence, Ludwig Wittgenstein claimed in 1922 to have dissolved all the problems of philosophy, writing that the problems are dissolved in the actual sense of the word, like a lump of sugar in water. On the social and cultural front, it was the age of democracy, when across the world women were getting the vote and slavery was being banned. But it was also what Matei Calinescu described as the age of ideology, when people like Marx and Freud tried to give exhaustive accounts of human life. It was the age of communism, anarchism and fascism, which each had a grand totalizing narrative that proposed a revolution in the ways society is arranged. Modernity had big dreams. It was cresting the wave of progress, and with the inevitable success of that wave, anything seemed possible. It was a time of audacious dreaming. By the second half of the 20th century, it became obvious that the vision was a fantasy. The promises of liberty, equality, of fraternity, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness began to appear increasingly hollow with every year. The brutality of the French in Algeria was hardly an embodiment of liberty, equality, or fraternity. The soldiers addicted to heroin in Vietnam were far from the Jeffersonian life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The millions of Vietnamese who even today suffer the downstream effects of the American Agent Orange would undoubtedly agree. Women had been given the vote, but were still ostracized from the workplace and very far from true autonomy. The African American community may have been technically freed from slavery, but to call them even second-class citizens in 1950s and 60s America would have been laughable. As the second half of the 20th century progressed, it became obvious that the equality and liberty that had been promised in modernity's wave of revolutions against the old powers was, for many, a horizon that drew no closer. The balance of power had shifted, but the hands that held it fitted the same demographic profile. But now, instead of monarchs and aristocrats, there were tycoons and bankers. Modernity had taken great leaps forward, but it was not enough. Cynicism began to set in. The dream of modernity was dead. In its wake, post-modernity emerged. The attitude of this post-modernity was everything that modernity wasn't. Bye-bye to the grand narratives, to the naivety and optimism, to utopian dreams of happily ever after, and the glorifying of science. Postmodernism began to poke holes in the lumbering carcass of modernity. The dreams of unity that modernity had dreamed were revealed to be skewed narratives. This wasn't just the case with clearly delusional modernist fantasies like fascism. It became clear that the glorious promises of modernity came with a set of terms and conditions: white, male, heterosexual, and preferably from a wealthy background. As the postmodern age emerged in the 1960s, however, people had had enough. Postmodernity was not about fulfilling utopian visions, it was about justice and about equality. The counterculture of postmodernity fought for the voices neglected and excluded by modernity.
Modern relativism is the view that what's right in one culture may be wrong in another, and that there's no way of judging between the two. It's all relative. There's no absolute truth of the matter. Different strokes for different folks, and that's okay. Imagine a Martian landing on Earth. She would see that people behave differently in different places. They've got different moral rules, different social customs. What's right in one location is wrong in another. She might well conclude that there's no such thing as the right way to live or the right thing to do for everyone at all times. It's all a matter of cultural norms. So in parts of Spain, bull fighting is seen as a spectacle, whereas in many other countries it's considered outrageous cruelty. Try setting up a bull ring in present-day London, for instance. If the visiting Martin could get an overview of the history of the world, she would see that in ancient Rome it was fine to have gladiatorial combat to the death and to own slaves, but that both practices would be widely frowned upon in present-day Rome, or Amsterdam, or elsewhere. Attending fights to the death and killing slaves was acceptable for the Romans, but would be wrong in today's Europe. This sort of relativism has been popular with some anthropologists who've attempted to appreciate other cultures from within, understanding setting of interwoven practice as responses to particular circumstances and traditions. They recognize that morality is different in different cultures, and they often argue that it's ethnocentric to impose your own set of values elsewhere, and if you know best. Some people go further and say that everything is relative, even truth. That what is true at one time at one place isn't true for everyone everywhere, or that there's no such thing as objective truth, just the truth according to me. We see hints of this in politics today. There is a big problem with this sort of relativism, so the theory of relativism itself would have its own account. Be relative, so the theory that truth is relative couldn't be absolutely true. That's all our presentation. Thank you very much, and see you next time.